Welcome back to our Life Group series where we're doing a little bit of discussion about the weekend and what we heard Pastor Cliff share. The last 2 weeks, Pastor Cliff has been talking about a new, or rather an old form of measuring. And he's been challenging us on what the idea is of how we count success. How do we measure success? Often in the world that we live in, success is measured through numbers, through stuff, through accumulation. Success is measured by how much property you have, what's in your retirement account, what's your car look like, what's your house like, do you have the 2.5 baths and the 2.5 kids and the 1.3 pets, and all of this stuff that we use to numerically count that somehow equals success. And yet last week we looked at the fact that success was really defined by obedience. This week we're going to look at another form of Jesus and how he measures success. And so when the disciples were asking him what the kingdom of God was like, Jesus looked at them and said, "Let me tell you what success in the kingdom of God looks like." And so he told this parable that you can find in Matthew chapter 25. And it's sometimes called the parable of the talents. It's sometimes called the parable of the 3 servants. But it starts in verse 14. And it says, "Again, the kingdom of heaven can be illustrated by the story of a man going on a long trip. He called together his servants and entrusted his money to them while he was gone. He gave 5 bags of silver to one, 2 bags of silver to another, and 1 bag of silver to the last, dividing it in proportion to their abilities. He then left on his trip. The servant who received the 5 bags of silver began to invest the money and earned 5 more. The servant who received 2 bags of silver went to work and earned 2 more. But the servant who received 1 bag of silver dug a hole in the ground and hid the master's money. After a long time, the master returned from his trip, and he called them to give account of how they had used his money. The servant to whom he had entrusted 5 bags of silver came forward and said, 'Master, you gave me 5 bags of silver to invest, and here I give you 5 more.' The master was full of praise, and he said, 'Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful in handling the small amount, so now I will give you many more responsibilities. Let's celebrate together.' The servant who had received 2 bags of silver came forward and said, 'Master, you gave me 2 bags of silver to invest, and I have earned 2 more.' The master looked at him and said, 'Well done, my good and faithful servant. You have been faithful in handling this small amount, so now I will give you many more responsibilities. Let's celebrate together.' Then the servant with the 1 bag of silver came and said, 'Master, I know that you are a harsh man, harvesting crops you didn't plant and gathering crops you didn't cultivate. I was afraid that I would lose your money, so I hid it in the earth. Look, here it is back.' But the master replied, 'You wicked and lazy servant. If you knew I harvested crops I didn't cultivate, why didn't you deposit my money in the bank? At least then I could have gotten some interest on it.' Then he ordered, 'Take the money from this servant, give it to the one with the 10 bags of silver. And to those who use well what they are given, even more will be given. And then they will have an abundance. But from those who do nothing, even what little they have will be taken away. Now throw this useless servant into the utter darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth.' And so as the disciples gathered around him and asked him, 'What is it like in the kingdom of God? How do we know that we're actually being successful with what you've called us to do?' Jesus said, this story, the story of a master and 3 servants, will let you know how God measures success. The thing that I always thought was interesting as I was reading through this is that there are numbers in this story. And so there were numbers that were being counted, but that wasn't the measure of successfulness. The first servant took 5 and made 5 and had 10, and he was called a success. The second servant took 2 and made 2, and he was called a success. And I looked at what Jesus was actually saying when he said the master addressed the servant, and there was a word that kept popping up. 'Well done, my good and faithful servant. You have been faithful.' See, in God's kingdom, the way to measure success is not by numbers, but by faithfulness. And so the 2 servants that actually went out and invested what they had, that didn't just sit on what they had, they didn't just try to protect what they had, but they took it and they tried to further it and advance it so that they could bless their master when he returned. They were faithful in what he had asked them to do, and so they were counted a success. But the other servant, I look at him and I think most likely what happened is his eyes got focused on the numbers as opposed to what it meant to be faithful. And so he looked at this bag of silver and he was more concerned with preserving the number that he had than going out and risking and being faithful for the master. And so he took what he had and he hid it. And when the master returned, he said, "You're being lazy with what I gave you. Even the little bit that I have gave you, if you had put it in a safe investment, would have returned something. But instead, you were so consumed by the numbers that you took your eyes off of the call that the master had given you, and you put your eyes on protecting what you already had." When we obsess over the numbers, we often lose sight on what it means to be faithful to the calling. This week, as you're with your group, I want you guys to think about a few questions. I want you guys to reread this Matthew story together. And I want you to think about what caught your attention. How did you feel when you were reading it? Did it feel awkward to listen to the master as he talked to the servants, as he interacted with them? Did you relate with one servant more than the other? I want you to think about, how does the world define success? And how has that affected the way that you have lived your life? Another question to consider is, what does it look like to be faithful? And how do we measure faithfulness as a measure of success? How do we define faithfulness and know when it is really there? What do we cling to thinking that it is ours, forgetting that everything came from the master to begin with? Where have you experienced faithfulness in your own life? And what is God asking you to invest in his kingdom?